It's a statement that Hamas and Iran will be listening to very carefully and saying, wow, we did a good job. So I think it's not a very good message. I think there are better ways to speak to allies. There are better ways to convene concerns. And I also listened to, in the opening, of issues of capabilities that enable targeting. And that means where the UK wants the Israeli Defense Forces not to be precise in their delivery of weaponry. It doesn't make sense. It's just bad policy.
Now, let us turn to those events in Israel where the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is coming under increasing pressure to secure a hostage release deal with Hamas following Saturday's shocking news that the bodies of 6 hostages, previously thought to have been alive, had been found in a tunnel in Rafah. Today, there have been street protests and a national strike in Israel, the first since the war in Gaza began, prompted by that Hamas attack on October the 7th, which was the deadliest in Israel's history. 1,200 people were killed then, as you'll remember, more than 250 taken to Gaza as hostages. Members of hostage families now believe that the Prime Minister is prioritising his own political survival over seeking a hostage release deal. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy here has used the return of MPs to Westminster to announce the suspension of those 30 out of 350 arms export licences to Israel. It is not an arms embargo, he insists, but the government here is considering there's a clear risk that the weapons could be used to commit serious violations of international humanitarian law. Let's hear David Lammy himself as he explained in the House and insisted that the UK continued to support Israel's right to self-defence.
This is not a blanket ban. This is not an arms embargo. It targets around 30, approximately 350 licences to Israel in total for items which could be used in the current conflict in Gaza. The rest will continue. Neither will the action we are taking have a material impact on Israel's security. This suspension only covers items which might be used in the current conflict.
Well, that was David Lammy. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself had a news conference earlier. He called for unity and forgiveness as protests against his government grow.
I am asking for your forgiveness that we did not manage to bring them back still alive. We were close, but we didn't achieve it. And I would also like to once again repeat this evening, Israel will not stand silently doing nothing facing this massacre. Hamas will pay a very heavy price for that.
Well, that's the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's talk now to Lt Col Peter Lerner, a former spokesman for the Israel Defense Force and Director General of a trade union group in Israel, which is closely equivalent to the TUC in the UK. Good evening to you, Peter Lerner.
Hi, good evening, Karen.
Hello there. May I ask you, first of all, what you make of the decision by the Foreign Secretary here, David Lammy, to suspend those arms licences? UK arms exports to Israel make up only about 1% of Israel's arms imports. But nevertheless, it is a statement of kind, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's a statement that Hamas and Iran will be listening to very carefully and saying, wow, we did a good job. So I think it's not a very good message. I think there are better ways to speak to allies. There are better ways to convene concerns. And I also listened to, in the opening, of issues of capabilities that enable targeting. And that means where the UK wants the Israeli Defense Forces not to be precise in their delivery of weaponry. It doesn't make sense. It's just bad policy.
Were the Israelis expecting this, do you think, Peter? The significance seems to be primarily political. As I said, there's a tiny percentage of those imports into Israel. But the fact that this is one of Israel's closest allies deciding there's a risk that some of these arms that are currently being sold to Israel could be used in violation of international law. We're talking about components for fighter aircraft, drones, that kind of thing.
I think there are better ways to seek out and understand. And even listening to the minister's messages, it was uncertain, it was perhaps, it was there is a risk that. I think there needs to be a much more clarity. I think Israel and the UK have very open working relationship, especially in issues with regards to defense issues. So there's really no reason to make things based on assumptions rather than on evidence and facts.
The Labour government had made it clear that it was looking at this issue of arms exports and has also undergone other decisions, things like not going to oppose arrest warrants for Israeli leaders at the International Criminal Court. You've heard that from Labour before now. And there's been the similar decision made, which is probably not viewed well by the Israeli government, but Labour felt that it wanted to do it and it was the right thing to do to try to show balance in this conflict, to restore funding to the UN agency in Gaza, UNRWA, which is offering help to Palestinians, so many of whom have been suffering gravely as a result of the two sides at war in Gaza.
Caroline, I'm not certain that my opinion on these issues, while obviously I have, is very relevant for this discussion. Of course, UNRWA has its problems. There needs to be a debate about the role of UNRWA, and there are people in Gaza suffering, and I'm not certain that UNRWA itself is best equipped to deliver the assistance that the people in Gaza actually need. They're deeply embedded together with Hamas, the fabric of Palestinian society. And they've been basically, as a UN organization, they've been overrun with Hamas and the likes of those terrorist organizations. So while obviously there are diplomatic concerns between the two governments, and I do think that actually the best way to solve those is through mutual dialogue, to understanding and raise mutual concerns. And I'm sure that the government to government actually do know how to do that. I think it needs to be better.
When it comes to these calls, these increasingly desperate calls on Benjamin Netanyahu to secure a hostage release deal, he, of course, blames Hamas as the sticking point. You know, it's been 11 months. Both sides have been suffering in the meantime. Hamas is still holding 101 hostages. What chance do you think there is of a release deal? And what about those people who are saying that Benjamin Netanyahu is putting his own political survival ahead of seeking that deal?
So the Histadrut called yesterday for a general strike today, a nationwide strike that actually took place across public and private sectors, from Haifa in the north down to Beersheba, municipalities, government bodies, different insurance companies across the board. It was significant, substantial, and it achieved its goal. It achieved the goal of shaking up the situation where the priorities of putting people first, namely the hostages, has been brought front and center. Prime Minister Netanyahu needed to address, because of the concerns that we raised over the last 24 hours, with hundreds of thousands of people coming out yesterday protesting, with the shutdown or slowdown in workplaces, in hospitals today, and in other workplaces. So I think that we sent a very, very strong message to Prime Minister Netanyahu that we expect that people be put first, as we do in the unions. We put the people first and profit afterwards. And the idea should be, especially in this dire situation, to reach a deal with Hamas via the mediators, America, Egypt, and Qatar, to bring back the hostages alive. The thought that 6 hostages that were executed by Hamas last week, they could have been, instead of being buried today, being held by their loved ones today in Israel, is heart-wrenching. And so our position is that there needs to be a bigger effort on Israel's side on Histadrut's message to the government is, let's get this done to bring as many as possible home. And indeed, the fact that the terms of the agreement have been basically known since mid-July now, and they seem to shift with different issues coming to air. And today, Prime Minister Netanyahu raised publicly the first time the issue of the the corridor, the Philadelphia corridor, which is across the border between Gaza and Egypt, shows that he has to listen. Will it actually change and push his policy in a way which will put people first? I still don't know to say. We are concerned, and we are concerned that he did not feel the need to be forthcoming with that up until now.
Okay. Well, Peter Lerner, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. We will all be watching and waiting to see what happens and whether there is an outcome. Benjamin Netanyahu saying there are certain things we won't compromise on and won't surrender to pressure, but the pressure from hostage families, friends just continues, it seems. Thank you very much, Peter.